everybody, and welcome back to my channel. And today I have a very special video. It's very special for me and my family, but I think everybody who watches this will also enjoy, especially if you have a family member who is military, former military, currently active. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a long time and finally have the opportunity to do it. And I am so excited to present it to you guys. So I got to go up to Waco, where my grandparents live, and interview my grandfather, who I call Paw. This is my dad's father. And he has some of the most amazing stories I have ever heard when it comes to his time in the Air Force. He joined in a very interesting time. He got to do a lot of interesting things, and he was in there for a very long time. And so I've been wanting to capture some of those stories so that way Declan can hear them when he gets older, so you can appreciate them as much as I do. And I think I'm going to do a couple of them, a couple of these videos, because I only got to do about 30 minutes worth of interviewing him this time. And I think I'm going to go up again and do this, capture some more, so I have more videos for you guys. But if this happens to be the only one, I'm glad I did it, because he gave me some amazing stories, some stuff I actually have never heard before, which is kind of amazing because I've heard a lot of these stories. But for the fact that I've never heard one of these before is absolutely outstanding. So to give a little backstory here, I had some questions prepared. I didn't put all of them in there because you don't want to hear my voice, but there's some that needed some context. You'll hear me in the background ask a couple of questions. But it was more so just triggers to get his mind going, to find that sweet spot of him to tell the story. And so I really hope you guys enjoy it. So without further ado, here is the interview with my grandfather. Thank you.
I'm Eddie Stow. I went into the Air Force in 1945. I served in Europe and the Korean War, and flew 35 combat missions in Vietnam in 1968, and retired from the Air Force with 23 years. I was a master sergeant. I retired as a master sergeant in the Air Force. I was a flight engineer on B-29s, on KC-97s, which were tankers. We refueled the bombers in flight. And the last one was on the C-141 cargo, and that's the one that I flew the missions in Vietnam. I was on it 3 years out of Dover, Delaware Air Force Base. I've been stationed in Europe and Germany, Spain, England, the Azores, Guam. I guess that's the overseas stations I was at. And statewide, I was Randolph Air Force Base, Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Lincoln Air Force Base in Sac. I was flight engineer on KC-97s, and that squadron refueling bombers in flight. Mountain Home, Idaho, same job. My last assignment was in Dover, Delaware, flight engineer on the C-141 4-engine jet cargos. That's the plane that I flew the 35 missions in Vietnam in. Then I retired in 1968, June the 1st. Well, I guess the hardest thing that I ever faced, other than flying combat missions and in Vietnam and all, I was scheduled on a refueling mission out of the Azores. That's out in the middle of the Atlantic. We had a high-ranking official flying from Offutt Air Force Base to Madrid, Spain, and they was loaded in the bomber. It was a B-47 bomber, and it was loaded for bear, so they couldn't land at our base or any base till they got there. And that night that we were supposed to refuel them, the wind came up. It was too strong of a crosswind to take off, and we waited and waited, and ops wanted us to go ahead and see if we couldn't take off by using all the runway, and we did. We took off on the end of the runway, and the pilot had no control over the airplane. In fact, he couldn't talk for about 5 minutes, and he tried to turn the airplane, and it just took its own control, which we made the flight okay. We got out of that crosswind takeoff and went on up and refueled the bomber that the high-ranking official was in, and then we had to go to Santa Maria by the Azores, which is a civilian airport, because the winds was too high for us to go back and land at lodges in the Azores. So we spent the night there, and the next morning we got up and radioed lodges to come in, and they told us, no, you can't go back, come back here, you're directed to go to Madrid, Spain. So we took off and we landed at Madrid. They had a bus to come out with 2 air policemen on it, and they confined us and escorted us to quarters in Madrid, at the base there. And they brought our meals to us, and we spent the night. And the next morning, they came to get us, the air police had a bus, and they took us to the airplane. And what it was, the inspecting general wanted to go to lodges, the Air Force Base in the Azores, and pull a surprise inspection on them. So that's why they sent us there to get them. And that's why we was consigned to quarters, that we didn't know what we was doing. And we flew the IG team back to lodges. That was quite an experience, but it was fun.
So what was your favorite memory from the Air Force? The one that you hold the most dear, or the one you reflect on the most?
Well, that's hard. I don't know which. I guess the base that I enjoyed being stationed at was Mountain Home, Idaho. Of course, we pulled alert over to Guam for 3 weeks at a time, and then back to Mountain Home. But I liked it. It was a good runway to take off on. And best of all, it was the best rainbow trout fishing of any place in the States. And I really enjoyed being stationed there. Of course, I was at Randolph many years before, from 52 to, I think, 59. I checked out on B-29s there, and the KC-97 tankers, and I stayed there till 59, and I got transferred to Lincoln Air Force Base, Nebraska, and SAC, and we spent more time on alert on bases all over the world, and we did it at the base there at Lincoln Air Force Base. But it was a good assignment. And then we from alert there, from Fort Churchill, our mission was, if there was a war, it was Cold War time, that we would take off and refuel bombers on the way to Russia. And we spent 2 weeks on alert, and Then we went back to our base at Lincoln, Nebraska for 3 weeks, then back to Fort Churchill and for 2 more weeks of alert. And that was probably the worst duty that I ever had in the Air Force. And it was cold in the winter times up there. It'd get 50, 55 below zero. And only air base I ever took off from that we left vapor trails on takeoff. Quite an experience.
So why did you choose Air Force rather than any other branch at the time? But technically it was the Army, right?
Army Air Corps.
It was Army Air Corps.
Because my brother was already in the Army Air Corps. He went in 59, 49, 39, because the war started in 41. He got in the reserves in 1939, and then in 1940 they activated him to full time.
Today, from these fronts all over the world, a series of flight paths lead back to the nerve center of all AAF operations, the continental United States. Here is the home base in December 1943.
And it was Army Air Corps, so that's why I guess that I chose the Air Force, which I'm glad I did. It had a lot of good experiences.
So tell me about Boxcar Willie, because I know he's one of my favorite people you talk about. And
Well,
he's a legend amongst, especially the Air Force world, but just...
Yeah, Boxcar Willie, actually it was Leland Liesl T. Martin was his real name. And of course we called him Marty. I never knew him as Boxcar until he had his show up in Branson, Missouri years later. He was a flight engineer on B-29s and on KC-97s when he got out of the Air Force at that time. We had flying KC-97s. He picked his guitar and sang songs to us when we was on alert and on barracks and all, and he was quite an entertainer then. And when we was at Lincoln, he got out of the Air Force, and he had a 15-minute showtime called the Lunch News, Farmers News, and he had 15 minutes that he picked his guitar and sang songs every day on that. And the sad part was his wife told him if he didn't get out of the Air Force, she would divorce him. And he got out and was working there and had a job singing on the Lunch News, and she left him and divorced him anyway. He ended up going out to Idaho, and he remarried in Idaho and Boise. And when I got stationed at Mountain Home, Idaho, well, I was going to work one day, and I always had my radio tuned to country music. And I heard this guy talking, and I says, well, that's Marty. And sure enough, it turned out to be Marty Martin, and he was a disc jockey on one of the stations in Boise, Idaho. That was 1963. And I didn't see him again until he had his show up in Branson, Missouri. But he was quite a guy. He was a good entertainer.
From the great Atlantic Ocean to the wide Pacific shore, to the queen of flowing mountain, mighty Southfield by the shore. She's mighty tall and handsome and known quite well by all. She's a combination of the Wabash Cannonball
he reserved seats for the 98th that he was in when he got out, and at Lincoln. And anyway, when we went up there, well, he had reserved seats for the 98th, and he always had us to stand up and introduce to every one of us. And at the end of the show, we had to go and all get on the stage at his squadron that he was in when he retired from the Air Force. The Air Force was my way of serving our country in peacetime or wartime. And gosh, I have so many experiences from just about all over the world that I remember and think. I'll tell one short one. When we was pulling alert up at Fort Churchill, well, and when our time to rotate every 2 weeks, so we flew back, well, the flight surgeon from our base and the chaplain had come up and spent a week to see how we made out on alert duty. Every morning at 8 o'clock we had a briefing on where we would be flying if there was a war, and the refueling. And then the rest of the time we was just on standby in an underground facility with 6 airplanes for us to take off in case there was a war. Well, the chaplain and the flight surgeon elected to fly back with us that when our time was up. And on takeoff, I lost number 2 engine because of an oil leak through a cylinder. It blew a gasket, and we had to feather that engine. And flying on 3, and we was too heavy. We tried to dump fuel through the boom, and it wouldn't come out. And so after a couple of tries, well, I had the boom operator to crank the boom in. And once he cranked it in and then cranked it back out all the way, well, I hit the auto retraction, and the boom came back all the way, and it sounded like a big blast when it come in. It made a lot of noise. But what it was, the nozzle was iced up, and when we brought it back in, it broke that ice loose, then we could transfer fuel. So we transferred fuel to keep us going up to a certain point. Well, the oil tank was a 55-gallon central oil tank, and the motor froze up on it, the pump, and we couldn't transfer oil to the engines. And so we was running out of oil, and we had to land in Winnipeg. They sent helicopters up to meet us and escort us into Winnipeg. And of course, when we landed that big old KC-97 there, that was a big airplane for that airport. And we was on national news. And the lady that lived next door to us back at Lincoln Air Force Base come over and got my wife, Gracie, and says, "Hey, your husband's on TV, he's in Canada." And sure enough, we made national TV landing there. But the chaplain, when we was flying, we had to fly at low altitude, and he asked somebody for a cigarette, and he didn't smoke. And the flight surgeons were standing behind me at my panel, and he said, "I can understand why some people get afraid of flying and don't want to fly." He says, "because it scared me." But it wasn't bad. We had experiences like that a lot of times. But that's just one of the times that you had things to happen to an airplane that you hoped wouldn't happen, but we always managed to take care of it.
One of those 9 lives that you...
Oh, yeah, well, a lot of times you'd have trouble in the airplane, and your worst time is in flight. For a while there on the KC-97s, the type of prop that they used had a habit of breaking off, and it would come right through the cockpit of the airplane, and it would be right between me and the co-pilot if it come through there. And anytime we had a runaway prop, well, that would sort of get your attention, and we had that a lot of times. And the runaway prop is that it'll speed up and you can't control it, and it just going as fast as it can until it breaks off. But I said you can't control it, you can manually. And the worst time that we had one to speed up like that, and you couldn't feather it, you couldn't stop the thing, well, we was able to control that one. But that was what you'd call a runaway prop. And they had trouble with that until they changed the props on it. And they had to completely change all of the props on the KC-97s. And no more trouble with props then. We made forced landings at different places if we had problems. Mostly it would be prop trouble or an engine trouble. Gosh, I couldn't name all of the bases that we had to go in and land, make emergency landings because something happened to the airplane. But we always managed to keep it flying until we could get it on the ground. That was my job as a flight engineer. I controlled all of the power for takeoff, landing, and power settings for cruise. That was my job, to make those changes and change them according to the altitude and what we're supposed to set the prop settings and all that for. The engineer stayed pretty busy, especially on the tankers. Now, on the bombers wasn't too bad. You could just sit there and watch the instruments, but on the tankers, well, you had a full-time job as an engineer. Keep that big old bird flying. But other than that, we just little minor things that would happen that we always come through on them okay. Maybe give you another gray hair or two. I had a bunch of times we made forced landings. One time was coming back from Fort Churchill. We landed in North Dakota at the air base there, and it was real cold, and we had prop trouble, and we had to land there and wait for them to bring us a new prop in. And we left the climate where it's probably 50 below zero, and even in North Dakota, where we landed at the air base there, the temperature was probably around zero or close to it. It was cold there. And we stayed there 2 days until they flew us in a prop and replaced our prop for us. But we had a lot of times that we had little emergencies, but we came through all of them. That's why I'm still here today.
So what's some advice that you would give your great-grandchildren moving forward in life from all the experiences that you've gone through and the things you have done? I mean, you've definitely lived one of the more exciting lives I've ever heard of, and from the places you've traveled and the things you've done. But what's some advice you'd give your great-grandchildren or your great-great-grandchildren that could come, and just some sound life advice that you would have for them?
Well, of course, you want your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren to be happy. And the best advice is always respect your mama and daddy, because they're going to do the best for you. And all of my grandkids have got good parents. And my daughters, 4 daughters, married guys, and they're good to the kids. And of course, my son, and he had the one son, and he has a wonderful wife. And of course, little Declan, he's up here with us now, and that's why we're sitting here talking. trying to get my brain to open up again.
They Thank you so much for watching, and I cannot express how thankful I am to my grandfather and also my wife Stacy, who was up there with me, who was watching Declan during the time, and my grandmother Momo. She was entertaining Declan the whole time as well, and just so grateful I got to do this. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please subscribe and leave a comment below and tell me what you think. Tell me your grandfather's stories. Tell me if you have a story yourself. You can post it here also on Facebook or anything like that. And I hope this inspires you to do the same thing. Set up a camera, record your own stories, or record a family member of yours that you would love to have. Just because you just never know when those stories are not going to be around anymore, and you want to do them justice. And who better to do them justice than the person themselves? We have the technology. Why not? So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and have a good day or not. The choice is yours.